We cover a lot of ground about UFOs and ET kind of subject matter and stories here on Coast to Coast. And just when you think you've heard pretty much all of it, along comes a story that sort of causes the hair on the back of your neck to raise all by itself. That's the story that's told in this new book, Aliens in the Forest, written by veteran UFO investigators Noe Torres and Ruben Uriarte. And it's a spooky one. It's weird. It's about an encounter in the forest of Northern California. Three guys go hunting, deer hunting, with bows and arrows. They get separated at night. One of them has to spend the night in a tree, and what he encounters out there in the forest has stuck with him for decades. Now, we'll be talking to Noe and Ruben in just a moment, but we also have some audio clips from the principal witness. And as we go to the break, I want you to hear in his words how this has affected him over all this time.
For a year, I had, screaming nightmares. I'd wake up yelling, those eyes, those eyes. I'd be just a cold sweat, just be drenched with sweat. I even thought about, when I was up in the top of that tree, I thought about just jumping off and jumping down the canyon and just killing myself. But the only thing that kept me going is I had the little girl, my wife, and that kept me fighting.
Aliens in the Forest, the Cisco Grove UFO Encounter is the new book by Noe Torres and Ruben Uriarte. Gentlemen, want to welcome you both to the program. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, George, for the invitation. And both Noe and I were looking very forward to being there with your audience.
I was thinking, Ruben, you and I go way back. I think I first met you in 1994 in the crop circle fields of England, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I found a photo. I'm going to have to send that to you. You're out there with the camera crew interviewing some people, and that was fantastic meeting you back then. And, since then we've crossed our paths on a number of occasions. You were one of our main speakers at the 2008 MUFON Symposium that we held here in San Jose, California.
You're not going to blackmail me with those old photos, are you? I still had color in my hair, I think.
George, you still look the same. You haven't changed.
Let's start this way, Ruben, with you. You had, did you first hear this story at a MUFON meeting? Is that, am I understanding that correctly? That somebody got up in a meeting in Northern California, and that's the first time you heard it?
Well, actually, the way I found out about the case was really through some files from our former Northern California director, Paul Cerny, who now has passed away. But back then, he had moved up to Western Regional Director, and then he was appointed. Then Mr. Virgil Staff, I don't know if you remember him, but he was appointed in that position. And at that time, I served as an Assistant State Director. But I came across these files, and I remember looking at the notes that were taken by Paul Cerny, and in those files, I started to read this incredible story of a gentleman that was, as you mentioned, was up there in the Tahoe National Forest, up there by Cisco Grove, close to going toward Truckee, toward the Reno border. And he had one incredible story where he was deer hunting and came across these beings that were trying to capture him in this incredible ordeal. And so I always wanted to meet this gentleman, and through another former colleague, I was able to meet with him and his family back in 2005, almost 41 years from the time that he had his first encounter, which was September 4th of 1964. And
no. Well, I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, what was amazing, George, is that his story is very much he stuck to the same story, but it was just being there and talking with him and meeting his family, and then also having the great fortune of working with Noe that we were able to put the Mr. Don Schrump's story into a book.
Noe, tell me this: how tough was it to win his confidence, Donald Schrump's confidence? We'll get into what happened to him, not only out there in the forest, but subsequently with the Air Force and ridicule and this so-called investigation they did. I would imagine he was a little gun-shy.
Yes, George. One of the key factors in this was that Mr. Shrum worked in for a company that built missiles for the U.S. military back in the 1960s, the Aerojet Corporation of Sacramento, California. So he actually had never, his name had never been given in any of the UFO witness accounts of the 60s following this UFO incident. And although most of the details of the case had been released, there was never an actual name of the witness ever given. In fact, this is the first book that's ever been done by anybody regarding this case. And Mr. Shrum, because of his familiarity with Reuben as MUFON State Director for Northern California, and because Reuben spent a lot of time with him there in his home and was a guest of his at his home, he was more than willing to open up to us and to tell us details that he had never previously released, including a lot of interesting details that came out during a session of regressive hypnotherapy that he underwent in the 70s. So it was just the right time. He's reached an age where he wants to make full disclosure. He's got some significant health problems, obstacles that are now facing him. And it's like a lot of other witnesses in major UFO cases that really are hesitant to come out with the truth until they get, close to the end of their lives, and they feel that, like Mr. Shrum, this is a case that really, really needs to be known by the public in its entirety.
But he was worried that because he works in a sensitive industry, that if this comes out, he'd be ridiculed, lose his job. So although he cooperated with some investigators, he never wanted his name associated with this. He's not trying to get rich off of it or, have somebody make a movie out of his story, right?
That's correct. He was actually a welder and a painter for a lot of the Polaris and Titan missiles that were being built by Aerojet in its Sacramento factory back in the early 60s. And it was a sensitive job, of course, because of the nature of the work and the defense contracts that Aerojet had at the time. And so he was convinced that if he spoke publicly about his UFO encounter, that there would be repercussions in his job. And in fact, all three gentlemen that were hunting that evening in the Tahoe National Forest, Mr. Shrum, Mr. Alvarez, and Mr. Trueblood, they were all three employees of Aerojet. And there are some bizarre connections that we can explore as we go on regarding, there's kind of a backstory regarding the Aerojet Corporation. But, yes, that's absolutely it, and that's the reason why he never fully disclosed all the details of the case and did not ever link his name or the name of his two hunting companions with what actually happened until just now in preparation for this book.
Okay, well, let's tell the story. Reuben, why don't you start it off? It's 1964. Mr. Donald Shrum and two friends decided to go deer hunting, bows and arrows, up in Northern California. Take it from there.
Yes, well, it was, again, September 4th, 1964. Both he and his friends went deer hunting, and they were going to use bows and arrows. During that particular season, only bows and arrows were permitted, not rifles. And as these gentlemen were camping out, they started their hunt early during the day, and later it was toward the evening. They continued their hunt. Dawn went up a ravine, and basically these guys had no walkie-talkies, but they had to be, they could see each other visually. But Dawn started to started walking up a ravine. And then he told him, and his other two friends yelled at him and said, "Why don't you meet us on the other side?" Well, what happened was that ravine turned out to be a lot further, and so it started to get very dark. And so because of that area, and that was known for bears and mountain lions and that, and for his safety, he found a tree that he decided that he was going to climb up and stay there for protection. That's what a number of hunters do in case they can't get back. They want to protect themselves from predators. So as he climbed up the tree and started setting his area of safety, it started to get dark. And then out in the distance, it was about towards around 7 p.m., and then there was a light that came out toward his direction. And as it got darker, he noticed the light getting closer, and he thought it was a helicopter. And then he didn't hear any noise, and the light came out a lot closer. And then all of a sudden, when he looked up, there was this enormous ship, a cigar-shaped ship. If I believe it was about equivalent to a 14-story building, is what as it was described.
And we don't hear about cigar-shaped UFOs much anymore, but back in the day, back in that time period, they were much more common, right?
Exactly. And then what makes this interesting is that there was the object maneuvered around, and then he saw a smaller light being emitted out of the object. It was basically a smaller scout ship, as he called it, that landed nearby. And I forgot one point. What he did was he climbed down the tree, and he lit a small fire, basically to signal the light, and that's what caused the light to come over to his tree because of the fire. But when he didn't hear any noise, of course, he got very frightened, and he climbed back up the tree. He wore some camouflage hunting clothing. So as this light that emitted from the object turned out to be a small scout ship landed, he then noticed these small humanoid beings walking around, observing basically the brushes, the manzanita plants, as what he had described.
I'll tell you what, Ruben, why don't we listen to an audio clip? I'm not sure, when was this particular interview conducted, by the way?
It was in September of 2005.
Okay, there's a clip number 4, Dan. If you'd play that, he talks about the arrival of what he described as these humanoids.
Yes.
And I heard some thrashing through the brush, and probably 5-10 minutes, these two humanoids come out of the brush. Then they came straight underneath the tree and looked up at me. And I knew right then I was fingered. Looked like 4 to 5 feet, and they had a silvery, like a one-piece suit on. I could see the two like eyes that were looked like welding goggles to me, and then the rest of the face was kind of a blur. I couldn't see looking down at them.
Noe, would you describe in greater detail what these things look like? We've put some images that you provided, images from the book, on the Coast to Coast website if anybody wants to follow along. But give me some more detail about what these two little beings look like.
Yeah, it's a fascinating description that's been given by this eyewitness. And he said that the humanoids were about 5 feet tall with black, flat-looking faces. There appeared to be no features to the face other than two very large, circular, dark eyes. At first appearance, it seemed to him that those big round eyes looked sort of like somebody wearing welder's goggles. So the general appearance of these creatures was short, stocky. There was this black, flat, featureless face. And by the way, they were wearing a tight-fitting one-piece silver-white suit with bellows at the elbows and at the knees. A very eerie figure. If you could imagine these strange figures. They seem to be wearing hoods around their heads. It may have been some kind of hood-like garment, according to Mr. Schrum, or it may have been some type of helmet. So really, in seeing these strange figures just break out of the brush all of a sudden, he had been hearing these noises coming toward him, approaching, and all of a sudden, they broke out from the brush, and they came slowly up to the base of the tree which he had climbed and from which he was looking down at them. And all of a sudden, they were just standing there. They turned their heads up at him, and that's when he realized, as he said in the audio clip we just listened to, that he had been found. Now, another interesting point, George, if I could just mention, the detail that Mr. Shrum gave regarding the two ships that he saw was amazing and very significant in this case. It was, as you and Ruben mentioned briefly a while ago, the mothership, as we call it, which was a larger ship that he first saw appear and approach him, was extremely large. It was 150 feet, according to Mr. Shrum, from stern to bow, which, as Ruben mentioned, is the equivalent of a 14-story building turned on its side. So this very impressive, huge, dark object, he described the hull as being almost completely dark. He just could see a faint, cigar-shaped outline. And then spaced evenly along the side of this massive ship were three large lighted panels, square rectangular panels. And it was out of the center of these three panels that the smaller ship came shooting out, and it shot down into a canyon, and then it flew over closer to where Mr. Shrum was, and it was out of the smaller ship that all of the beings that he saw this evening came out of. I was wondering if we might be able to back up and listen to Mr. Shrum's description of the mothership, if we could, George. Maybe
we can. We're going to have to do that after the break because we wouldn't have enough time to get it in. We're going to a break in about a minute and a half or so here. I wanted to ask either of you these descriptions of the clothing. Now, we think about aliens now, and they don't have outfits like you're describing here, but there are in the UFO literature other cases of little strange beings wearing uniforms like this, right?
Yes, these particular beings were wearing basically protective suits, and unlike what we see today or what's been described from a number of other people, where they'll describe beings without wearing uniforms. As Noe had mentioned, they wore like these white uniforms with puffs around their around the elbows and the helmet. And there's been other cases that we were able to find in other cases in the past, and that's one of the reasons why we like very much to go back at these historical cases that offer so much rich information and description. So it could be just that. Another thought, George. As scientists, when they go into an area where they're researching, particularly, let's say, in laboratories, but now there's so much attention of sending our robotic spaceships into other planets, how much attention is placed on not contaminating the area. And I'm just curious, I was just wondering about that myself, is that it just could be that they were wearing these protective suits because the way they were approaching their interest in the plants and the rocks and the whole environment might have been for the purpose of not contaminating. But that's just speculation there.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Now, as you would describe it in the book, Aliens in the Forest, these little beings, whatever they are flitting around looking at plants and rocks, and then they walk to the bottom of the tree and look up at him, and that must have been one heck of a moment of sheer terror when he realized that they had focused their attentions on him. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll hear his description of the mothership and continue our conversation with Noe Torres and Ruben Uriarte. Marshall Tucker taking us into the break here on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with Ruben Uriarte and Noe Torres about their new book, Aliens in the Forest. And we sort of set the stage now. The primary witness, Donald Shrum, is up in a tree. There are strange creatures down on the ground. And this is where it starts to get really hairy because he has an absolute battle for survival with not only these living creatures, but with something else that comes out of the woods. We'll get into that and more right after this on Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp, in tonight for George Norrie. The scene is this. It's 1964 in the deep forests of Northern California. Three hunters are out in the woods. One of them gets separated and lost. He decides to climb up a tree to spend a long, cold night, protected, though, there from other predators, and then a light appears. We're going to back up just a little bit and get Donald Schrumm's description of the appearance of this thing that he described as a mother ship. Dan, if you will.
I saw a light. It looked like a lantern going up and down a trail, but then it came over the top of a tree, and I got kind of excited then because I thought it was a helicopter from the Forest Service. I stood between two of the fires that I built on the rocks and waved my arms and yelled and screamed, and finally that light started coming towards me. So I was really relieved then because I thought it was a helicopter still. But it just hovered there with no sound. So then I panicked because I knew it was no helicopter. I thought it was something from outer space. But it looked like all I could see is about an 8-inch glow. So I thought it was just a little tiny flying saucer. And then I kind of panicked and I threw my bow up in the tree again and hand walked out there, that limb, and got up in the tree. And I had all camouflage clothing on, so I figured, well, they won't see me here, But then this light went a half circle around me over the canyon. Then I could see the shadow of the whole spacecraft. And that was just a light that was on the nose of it.
Noe, if you would, help provide some context here. I mean, at the time, 1964, we don't have the familiarity with UFO stories and abduction scenarios, things of that sort. This was really foreign and alien at the time, right?
Yes, this is a very early major UFO case, and it was looked into by the civilian UFO organizations of the time, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, Jim and Coral Lorenzen.
Oh, we'll get into that. We'll get into that.
And many others. But you're right. This was one of the earliest, and it's right up there in terms of significance with the Barney and Betty Hill abduction of the same time period. One of the reasons that this was not covered as extensively as Barney and Betty Hill was the fact that Mr. Shrum was hesitant because of the fact that he worked for the missile defense contractor. He was hesitant to give his true identity, and in fact, he was hesitant to go public with this story. As you may have noticed in listening to some of the audio clips, he's kind of a shy and reserved individual. The farthest thing from his mind is seeking publicity for himself. It's only because now he feels that this is a story that has to go out in public. He'd like to know, even to this day, he's affected by the experience that he underwent that evening, this 12-hour struggle that he had against these forces that to this day he doesn't understand. So he'd like to know more about what he went through, and he'd like for people to hear what happened to him. So that's the reason that he's finally speaking out in this new book.
And Ruben, we're going to now jump into some of the subsequent events, but as a precursor to that, when you describe what had happened, the aliens are landing, they're running around in the bushes looking at rocks and plants, and then they discover him. It was not like they were there to get him or to grab a human. It was just sort of an incidental, like a bonus for them.
Exactly. What he noticed was that the two small humanoids then began walking right up to the tree and started looking at him. And they started to climb up the tree, and that's when he realized. That's when Don realized. He said that he better do something, or he was there. He didn't know what the motive was, but he sure didn't want to get captured by these two beings.
Okay, tell me what happened.
Well, what happened was these two beings were trying to climb up the tree, and he immediately started to throw things at them. He threw coins. He threw a canteen at them. He had matches he had a number of matchbooks, and he started to light them on fire. He started breaking branches, and then he started to move the tree, sway it back and forth. and then immediately those beings would climb down. They were trying to climb up on each other, trying to get them, and they would immediately back away from the tree, and then they would come back again, and then try to grab them. Well, then out of the bushes, he noticed another being walking toward the tree. Only what he noticed was that the eyes were like a fiery orange color, and this being, or as it turned out, what he described was a little bit bigger than the other two, and it was basically more of a robot-like creature. What happened was that the robot opened its mouth, and it started to emit this vapor, and this vapor would start going up the tree, and it would start to it would knock him out temporarily. He almost fell down to the ground, and his boat kept him from falling. So he immediately climbed up further up the tree, and he tied himself to the tree. And there comes back the aliens. They went climbing back up the tree again, and he would start swooing the tree back and forth, and again they would back up. And so this went on throughout for a long time. And the robot would come back, emit another gas vapor up, and trying to knock him out. Finally, he decided that he ran. After getting rid of all his clothing, his hat, and his gear, what he had remaining was his 3 arrows. So he immediately started to shoot at the robot. He did not want to shoot at the 2 humanoids. He felt that they weren't there. He felt that they weren't causing any major harm to him, but it was this robot. And so he fired at the robot, and the arrow, the velocity was like that of a bullet. It would hit the robot, and the robot creature would basically back up for about a couple of feet, and then he would go back to up the tree and try to gas them again. So this went on, and then we had another extraordinary event that happened later on, and perhaps Noe would like to jump in onto that there because.
Why don't we wait a second? Let's hear a little bit more audio from Mr. Schrum, where it's cut number 12, where he discussed this gassing episode, where these robots put this gas that comes out of their mouth, kind of like a steam vapor, and the effects it has on him. Number 12.
Yeah, that was really unusual.
These 2 humanoids stepped back from the tree, and another robot came, and there was 2 about the same place that the 2 humanoids were, and they stood facing each other, and flames, just like lightning, came between them. Then the gas was so thick coming up the tree that it dissipated just about the time I got to me. But then that's when I'd start to gasp for air, and then when I woke up from that, it was light, but the sun hadn't come up yet. I was just hanging by my belt, and they were gone.
Noe, you've developed sort of some theories about what kind of gas that might have been.
Yes, Reuben and I did some research into what types of gases would cause a person to suffocate, and of course the most obvious answer is some type of asphyxiant. The typical asphyxiants that we think of would be like nitrogen or helium or argon. These are gases that when they are released into the area where a human being is, they cause all of the oxygen content in the surrounding air to be lowered, and so the person then suffers the effects of a lack of oxygen. And while it's not toxic and doesn't do any damage in a general sense, it can be lethal in the sense that it can actually suffocate a person if enough of this asphyxiant gas gets introduced into an environment, where humans are. They could possibly suffocate. But in Schrum's case, there was limited exposure to this until the very end of his struggles. Earlier in the evening, he had been exposed to just small amounts of this asphyxiant, which caused him to pass out just for a few moments. And he knows, he's told us several times that he wasn't out for very long during the initial gassing episodes because when he would wake back up, he would see that the humanoids were trying to climb the tree again, and they would never quite get far enough up close to him before he would wake up. So that's how he knew that that he wasn't blacked out for very long. But then at the end, the audio clip that we just heard, at the very end of this night-long battle with these strange forces, the two robots got together. There was this lightning-like spark that flew between the two creatures, and then a huge volume of this asphyxiant went up into the tree above them, and that totally knocked Mr. Shrum out in the end. And he was not aware of anything then after that until daybreak, which was at about 5:30 a.m. Pacific time at that time. And when he awoke, of course, he was very concerned about whether or not they had finally reached him in the end during that final blackout period. And so that's when we have a lot more interesting elements to the story.
Well, we'll come to that. I want to back up just a second. You say in the book that he had the impression that there was some kind of communication between the ship and these beings on the ground. And how could he tell that?
That's a very interesting part of the story. Mr. Shrum has told us that he would notice that the humanoids would change their behavior in terms of what they were doing, and they would try a different tactic, for example. According to some audible signals that he could hear filtering through the forest, and his impression was that these audible signals, which sounded like bird song or it sounded like owl song, his impression was that this owl-like hooting or cooing sounds were coming from the mothership, which was hovering nearby. And whenever he heard these audible signals, he associated that with changes in behavior. There would be a new strategy on the part of the humanoids. Also, it's also possible, he's told us, that the robot-like creatures were also influenced by these sounds as well, because a lot of times, the discharge of vapor would come after these audible signals were heard. And for the rest of his life, any time that he was out in the woods, Mr. Shrum, whenever he heard owls in the distance, that caused him a great deal of consternation and stress because he would remember back to this time. So that was a very interesting. His impression was that there was actual communication going on between the mothership, the humanoids, and the robot-like creatures, all simultaneous.
Reuben, you said he dropped coins, he dropped matches, trying to start a fire. He threw his canteen, some clothing items. Finally, all he had left were these 3 arrows. It sounds like he was a pretty experienced hunter. He shot the arrows at the robotic creatures. Did he hit them all 3 times?
Yes, he hit that one robot all 3 times, and he actually when he came to early in the morning, he was just dangling from the tree, as Noe was describing after him being gassed by these 2 robot creatures. He woke up and he was able to come to, and then he climbed down the tree and he was looking for his items, which he was able to recover some. His canteen, I believe he found only two of his arrows and some other items, but strangely, what he noticed was all the coins were gone.
Souvenirs.
All the souvenirs, yes. We're real interested in that because why were they interested in the coins? Was it because they were shiny objects, or perhaps there's a lot of detail in those coins that tell why do people collect coins? Because of the history that's behind them. Who knows? But that was one of the speculations.
So when he hits this robot with the arrows, it just kind of pings off of him, creates a little bit of a spark, but it doesn't go through. It doesn't pierce the metal or the covering.
Exactly. It does bounce off at a 45-degree angle. Basically, is how he describes it.
And did it affect the robot's behavior?
Well, the robot would just keep coming back. It wasn't until after he finished with Zeros, and then, as Noah had mentioned, there was another scout ship that had landed with more humanoids, and then this other robot object that had also this robot creature that also walked up to assist the other robot to knock out the.
In the next hour, we'll get into the subsequent investigations and alternate theories that are proposed, which are pretty weak. But Noe, tell me this: why can't this just be a couple of scientists in hazmat gear out gathering samples in the forest, humans as opposed to aliens?
Well, as we're going to find out later, Mr. Shrum and family members conducted investigations into the activities that were going on in that area with the military and with other agencies, and they never were able. This is a very remote, isolated part of the Tahoe National Forest. There was no record whatsoever in all the checking that they did. There were no military maneuvers going on. There was no group or organization out there in this remote wilderness on that day at that time. And also, of course, you've got a 150-foot wide object hovering in the air above them. Mr. Shrum was very familiar with the technology that the military had at its disposal in the 60s, working for a missile defense contractor for the U.S. government. So obviously this was a technology that was far beyond what we had then and even what we have today. So it was quite obvious to him that these were forces from beyond the earth, without a doubt.
And the other two hunters, now they don't have the story in the same detail as Mr. Shrum, but they did see some lights. They did see something that at least verifies part of the story, Ruben?
Yes, what we have basically is the one gentleman, Mr. Alvarez, who was the companion hunting companion with Don, Vincent Alvarez. He's now deceased. They basically did give a written affidavit stating that he did see an initial appearance of the mothership. He saw a bright light making these maneuvers, and so it wasn't until later that he added to Don Shrum's story, as well as the other gentleman. He never did give any formal statement as to whether or not he actually saw something.
Okay, we'll get back into what other support there is for Mr. Shrum's story, and then get into what happened to him at the hands of the Air Force and some UFO investigators as well. The Yardbirds, taking us into the break from way back in 1966. I'm George Knapp, in tonight for George Norrie here on Coast to Coast AM.